Welcome to another episode of Metal Mastermind. Now, in today's episode, we're going to talk about making your bass sound fantastic in your mix. Now, this is a little bit of a subjective topic since bass sounds different to many different people. We have different flavors of bass. Not everybody's using finger picking. Some people actually use a pick. So in metal, while there are some variations in bass tone, we can find somewhat of a middle ground between all of them. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Jason, are you ready to record some bass?
Yeah, dude, I'm ready. Let's lay down some metal bass tracks.
I don't know what to say, man, but you're playing bass, not guitar. You know that, right?
Oh, yeah. Sorry, dude. No, we just snuck that little part in there, and that's for you guitar players who like to lay your own bass tracks. We're going to talk a little bit more about that at the end of the video and give you some really helpful tips for your mix when you're playing bass. So make sure you hang around for that.
Okay. Now that you got that out of your system, guitar players, man, I tell you, right? What bass are you going to be using for this recording?
Ken, we have got the ESP LTD D5 5-string bass, and this bass has active pickups. These are EMG designed active pickups.
Nice. And what are you going to use to record it?
So I'm going to run this bass through my PreSonus Quantum 2 interface, and I'm using Studio One Pro. Now, here's the kicker for this first track. I'm not going to use any plugins whatsoever. This is just a completely dry signal.
Recording bass is actually quite simple. For most situations, we'll be using a DI box. Now, you can also go directly into your interface if you do not have a DI box. What is a DI box? Well, a DI box, DI stands for direct injection. Some people like to say direct input. And that's quite accurate because when you record with a DI, you are essentially plugging in your bass or your guitar, can take an instrument level signal, and it's going to convert that into a microphone level signal. So you're probably thinking, why would I want to do that? Well, first things first is with a DI box, you actually get to record two separate signals. One is going to be the direct signal from the bass or guitar, and the separate one is a parallel output that can be used to be recorded with an actual amp. So you can get your bass tone, and you can also get the actual bass itself. And the purpose of doing this is, well, when you're in the mix, sometimes the tone that you originally started with your amplifier doesn't always work. So we're going to actually take that information, and maybe we might have to revisit and re-amplify that signal to something that suits the track a little better. Now, the beautiful thing about DI period is that while within the box, with all the emulations that we have nowadays, you can get a pretty good bass sound just off the cuff, and most of the time this is what we do. Some engineers actually forgo doing an entire bass cabinet entirely just because it's a little cleaner. And, well, with all that bass information, bass frequencies tend to get muddy really, really fast. So it's actually not such a bad idea to go simple with this one.
All right, so there's our initial bass track. Let's send that over to Ken.
Got it. So yeah, this sounds good. It does. No. Believe me, it sounds good. But it's a little rough around the edges, right? You see now, as a mix engineer, what I'm looking for from a recording is a signal that's already ready to work with, right? A lot of people get this mistake, and it's not really that much of a mistake, Rather, it's a workflow preference. Back in the day, when we had no digital computers and recording clean every signal, well, engineers actually had to make the sound of the source that they were working with sound really good before it got on to tape. The purpose of doing that was that you had more control within the mix later on. And back when we had finite amount of processing within the studio, like if you didn't have a piece of gear, you just didn't have it. You couldn't download a plugin. So they needed to really streamline that workflow. Nowadays, everybody gets so comfortable by just recording plain and clean into their DAW that they do all their mixing in the DAW, which is fine. But sometimes when you do that, you kind of miss out on opportunities to save on computer processing power. So one thing I really like to do is just, while I'm recording, tag on a little bit of compression or tag on a little bit of EQ. That way you get closer to the sound that you're looking for right off the bat, and when you're in the mix, you're not really struggling too hard to get to that first stage. You're already there by the time you're starting to mix. So now I know what you're probably thinking, Ken, that's risky. Yeah, that's why we had engineers do this kind of stuff. But you should play around with it. You might actually find that it might help you in your workflow, because when you're given every option in the world from a blank slate, you probably don't know what to do with it, right? If you give yourself a pathway, you're going in the right direction right off the get-go. So it's not really all so bad. It might actually force you into a way to make a decision. Now, Jason, can you please add some compression?
To elaborate on Ken's point here, again, you want to send over the driest signal possible, the purest signal possible, whether you're playing directly through the studio or if you're using an amp. You really don't want to attach too much to that, if anything at all. However, when you're playing a 5-string bass, or if you're down-tuned, sometimes those super low notes can produce some unwanted frequencies, and it may be a good idea just to use a stock compressor plugin in your studio and record that before sending that track to the person that's going to be mixing the song or the album. Or if you're recording your live amp, if you're miking your bass amp, you may want to use a compressor pedal with that so that it compresses that signal before going into the studio. So that way you've got a nice clean track to send over to the person that's going to be mixing this. Alright, so I think we've got a little bit cleaner bass track to send to Ken now so he can work his magic. Let's send that over to him.
Let's go check it out, shall we?
So, looking at the stock suite that we've got going on here for bass, check it out. So I've got a couple of things going on. We've got first some compression just to tame the volume. Then I've got a little bit of a sort of surgical type of EQ happening here, just to give a little bit more presence into that lower mid range. One of the things that I want to really show you here is that when I'm working with bass, I'm focusing on giving a little bit more low mids to the bass and a little bit more sub bass to the drums, right? So check that out. Here's the drum EQ and there's the bass EQ. You can almost see it right over here, right? So we've got that sort of 350, 400 area of the bass, really taking the the spotlight of that area, and then down below we've got the drums sort of dominating the subs. That's an example of doing pockets in the mix. Okay, so then after that we've got this LA2A type of compressor here, which is emulating this opto compressor style, and optos are really great for controlling long notes because they have a very slow attack and a slow release on their parameters, and you actually can't really control optos parameters except for the incoming gain and also the peak reduction, or really that's sort of like playing with the threshold in a sense. and the ratio in one knob. But the LA2A is just a really great choice for bass, because bass, what we're trying to do is keep that voice steady like a rock, okay? That's what we do with bass all the time. After that, we've got our EQ just to help compensate a little bit for some of the things that we sort of reduced in that compression. And then we have another compressor just to elevate the entire thing as a whole. Now, one thing to remember about frequencies is that when you're using compressors are also tonal shapers. Why is that? Because frequencies have different amounts of energy behind them. It's easier to boost high frequencies because they don't require a lot of energy to do that. They also dissipate easier, which is why when we listen to our speakers, we want to make sure that they're pointed right at us, because those high frequencies are very directional. But with bass is very omnidirectional, so they'll go everywhere, but they also require more power. So when we compress something, we are reducing the volume of the high, so when something sounds a little shrill, it helps to reduce that. But then when we elevate the gain at the end with the makeup gain, that's going to bring up some of that low end, because that compressor is limiting the dynamic range, bringing up the quiet stuff, which includes some of that sub. So that's why we always say, ooh, compression makes things warmer. Yes, it does, right? So I've got here a Neve console emulator right over here. This is the 88 RS legacy version, one of the premier like Neve consoles that you can find out there. This is a channel strip version of that, which I've got a limiter and compressor engaged and an EQ engaged all in once. And one of the things about Neve components is that they use transformers. And transformers, they have a really great way of emphasizing certain harmonics, especially odd harmonics, which makes things sound a little bit edgier. So we've got that with this plugin, which when I'm trying to emulate that kind of stuff, I have to compensate that with like EQ, and like getting harmonic saturation with just EQ is really tough. You have to do like sort of layers and layers and layers of EQ, and you'll see that when I'm doing actually the guitars, because I did use some harmonic saturation, and that's very hard to emulate with EQ. So right over here, I've got another plugin. It's called the F6 from Waves, and what this is a dynamic EQ. What is a dynamic EQ? Okay, well, similar to like a multi-band compressor, when I'm working with a multi-band compressor, right, I can control different frequencies and compress them that way. But with a dynamic EQ, I can control multiple frequencies like a normal EQ, but I can also say that after a certain threshold, I can either increase the gain on that specific frequency, or I could lower the gain. So it can kind of act like a normal compressor, or it can act like an upwards compressor. And when it passes a certain threshold, it'll increase the dynamic range. Kind of cool. I really love that about this EQ, and I've used a little bit of that in this bass track. What I've got over here is also CLA, Chris Lord-Alge, famous, wonderful, awesome. I met the dude, great engineer, and he really knows his stuff. This suite is like so good. It's excellent at speeding up your workflow. So I love Chris Lord-Alge's suite. So I'm using a little bit of that stuff here. And what I get over with this plugin, it's just a little bit more control and some color with distortion and some pitch. So what I'm doing is I'm emulating that sort of distortion and pitch with the stock plugins by using compression and stuff like that. But I've also got this chorus as a stock version to emulate the chorus that's going on with Chris Lord-Alge. I'll give you a tip here when it comes to bass. When you're mixing bass, the thing about bass is when it's solid in the center, it's easy to identify, and we love that, and most of the time we keep bass right in the middle. But when you turn it into a stereo chorus effect, you get this widening that works really, really nicely when it comes to full guitars. So it helps to spread and fill the stereo field. I love using chorus, just a tinge of chorus. I've got it at 27% here, and you'll just see it just adds just a little bit more dimension to the track, right? So we've got drums and bass, and I started with those two. I made pockets, especially with those low frequencies. It's really important because a lot of that mud comes in the low frequencies. So I've emphasized somewhere around, 200 to 400 hertz for more of that bass so that you can hear that tone coming out of the bass. I also subtracted some around, mid frequencies 1 to 4 kilohertz, took a little bit of that out with the bass, and I had the drums emphasize the sub and the highs because you got that cymbal splash going on there, right? So now I've got the guitars dominating the mid-range in this tune. I've taken out much of that low mid so that the bass could really take a hold of that area, but not enough to completely eliminate it out of the guitars. I still want that richness that's in the low mids. I just don't want it to collide as much, right? So now I've got the rhythms, the bass, and the drums. What's left? The overall mix.
Now for the little bonus part. If you remember at the beginning of this video, Ken and I said we were going to give you some tips on recording bass towards the end, and this is mainly for guitar players who like to lay their own bass tracks. I'm one of those people. Now, if you're a bass player, we strongly encourage you to keep watching this because I want you to chime in the comments and leave us your thoughts below. So there are two basic rules that we want to share with you when it comes to recording bass. And again, this is especially for guitar players that want to lay their own bass tracks. Rule number one is the bass guitar isn't necessarily going to play every single note that the guitars are playing. You may have some parts where the guitar is really busy and doing more riffing, and in those parts, the bass actually might be just kind of holding that rhythm, holding out those notes and holding that rhythm, just keeping that going. If you have everything doing the same thing at one time, it's just going to sound jumbled and muddy. Now, there are times when the bass is going to be riffing. And what I'll say to that is during those moments, you may have the guitars backing off just a little bit. A good example, if there's a part of a song that has just straight power chords kind of being held out, well, the bass might want to move around a little more just to keep the song kind of moving there and just give it some more dynamics. Now, that doesn't mean that there won't be parts of the song, especially when you're playing more extreme metal, where the guitar and bass are moving around quite a bit together. But again, the bass might not be playing the exact same notes as the guitar is playing, so just remember that. Rule number two is you have to be in a different mindset as a guitar player when you're laying your bass tracks. Don't act like you're playing your guitar. The bass is giving out a different vibe than a guitar, and the bass guitar track really should be following the drums more than anything else, because bass and drums, that's your foundation of your music. That's the backbone of that song. And that's one of the most important things to remember, to make sure that the bass guitar track and the drums are aligned together. And that's going to complement everything else that's going on in the music.
That's all for today, folks. If you're not a part of Metal Mastermind's community yet, Be sure to go to metalmastermind.com/join to download a free guide to our ultimate guide to the home studio. It's about 16 pages and it walks you through with no fluff on what you need for your home studio and whether you are trying to build one or you're trying to upgrade your current one. And if this episode was helpful to you, make sure that thumbs up button is blue and that you subscribe to Metal Mastermind and click that bell notification so that you get updates from the YouTube algorithm. It tells YouTube that you actually want to see this information. Anyway, guys, we got a lot of really interesting new things coming to Metal Mastermind, some big plans. We're going to keep you updated on what that is very shortly. So without further ado, stay metal.